Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me here today to speak to you guys. Um, I'm a functional medicine physician, and a functional medicine approach is a systems-based approach to medicine. And that's why Howard and Nancy were saying that all this ties together, because even though we're presenting these as separate topics, they are not separate at all. There is tremendous overlap, and what affects one part of the system affects the rest of the system. And so as I present today about toxins, I'm talking about toxins and how they relate specifically to dementia. However, they can affect your system in many, many different ways. And so I want you to keep that in mind, even though I might be talking about it in a very circumscribed way. So first, I want to give you some definitions, and by no means do I want to get super technical, but I do think it's important to talk a little bit about what these different things mean, because you might hear these different terms. So something that's toxic, obviously, is something that's capable of causing injury or death, something that's considered poisonous to the system. And usually it's a dose-dependent thing, but we will see that in our body, even small amounts can have big effects on our health. So a toxin is actually a natural substance that's produced by something that's living on this earth, plant, animal, fungi, or bacteria, but it can have a toxic effect on our system. Now, there's a different term for other chemicals called toxicants, which are types of poisons that are actually man-made, introduced into the environment by all of the lovely processes and chemicals that, and manufacturing that we do, and they can also have toxic effects. So I'm just going to use the term toxin, but if you, in doing your research, find the word toxicant, that's what that means. It's just man-made. A xenobiotic is a chemical that is foreign to the body, but it mimics a hormone or some other compound of the body, and therefore can have an effect on the body. So it comes from the outside world, but it can mimic, in some cases, be much more potent than some of the substances that we have in our own body, and therefore can dysregulate our system and be problematic. And then my favorite one is the POP, the persistent organic pollutant, which Nancy alluded to, which substances that bioaccumulate and they persist in the environment. And as you have animals that go up the food chain and then eat other animals, these substances can accumulate in that animal's system. Then the next larger animal eats that, and then they have their own persistent organic pollutants that then accumulate. And so it's almost like a concentrating effect. And this is one of the reasons why some of these smash fish, which are smaller, don't have as many pollutants in them, just because by the fact that they're smaller, they haven't accumulated as many of them. So that's very important in choosing some foods for yourself. So how do toxins get into our body? Well, there's the three classic ways, right? First is we can inhale them through what we breathe. Now, everybody knows if you're standing behind a city bus, right, and it like lets out this big cloud of diesel fumes, you're breathing in a bunch of air pollution. However, we're all breathing in air pollution to some extent on a daily basis. And what Howard said is very important. It's a major cause of dementia. It's also a major cause of lung illness and other issues, because just that pollution that we take in through our lungs gets into our circulation, into our body, and can be another cause of that leaky gut, that overly permeable intestinal membrane that Nancy spoke about. Other things that we breathe in can be volatile organic compounds like solvents, formaldehyde, toluene. Nail salons are terrible. If you're, at a hair salon, there's hairspray and the toxins that come from dyes and things as such. And mold toxins, those can affect us quite heavily. And even some fragrances and chemicals that, we have been programmed by our society to believe makes our home and our laundry smell super fresh, can actually be causing a great deal of endocrine dysregulation and could probably be increasing our risk for hormonal cancers quite considerably. So think about that, what we breathe. The lungs are a very permeable membrane, and we're inhaling a lot of things through that, and it's a great surface area, just like our gut. So the next is, of course, our gut. So ingested in the food that we eat is not just nutrients, but we can get heavy metals ingested through there. We can get chemicals that come in on plastics, which is why drinking out of plastic water bottles could be problematic. and having food stored in plastic containers. And mold toxins also can get in through our food. I'm going to talk a little bit about molds as well. And interestingly, most of the research done on molds is done in animal science, because the way that our animals are raised nowadays is that they're fed a ton of grains in order to get them fat as quickly as possible, to make as much money off of them as possible, they're getting them to market quickly, even though most of them eat, grass, or in the case of chickens, bugs and insects, not corn and soy. And they store these grains in these big silos that over time will then get some humidity and grow a certain amount of mold on them. So animals and ourselves actually are fed lots of foods that have a certain amount of mold in there, even though we might not see it. And the animals have been developing joint problems, all kinds of neurological issues. And so a lot of research has been done in veterinary science as to how to ameliorate some of these effects of mold toxins on the animals, because it does make them so sick. We also can ingest mold toxins through our food. And the foods that are most problematic, as you would imagine, are things that can be stored as grains and or things that can get moldy and then processed or ground up so that we don't notice that there's mold in there, like tomato sauce, which could be a problem, like peanut butter, which could be a problem, and coffee grains, if we get it already ground, could also be an interesting dilemma for us for molds. Interestingly, though, we can absorb much more mold toxins, about 600 times more, through our lungs than through our gut. But if, as Nancy spoke about, we have an increased leaky gut, that's going to increase the chance that we will be absorbing more of that mold through our gut. So very important to have as healthy a gut as possible, because that's how we get exposed to the outside world. We can also have toxins get absorbed through our skin, and this is happening all the time. I'm going to talk a little bit about beauty care products, things that we, from our clothing, which now is often made out of recycled water bottles, and now we're exercising in them, which I think is ironically hysterical, and absorbing some of those plastics through our synthetic materials as we sweat to get in better health, through the laundry detergent that we're using that keeps residues on our clothing, through lotions, through creams, through makeup. All of these things are ways that we can get toxins absorbed into our body. Now, there's two other things that I want to mention about toxins in our body that are not on this slide, but I think that they're important for us to know. And they really aren't ways that they get in, they're ways that they might be already in our system, but we might have an increased release of those toxins. And so that's why it's not on the slide, but I want to mention it to you. So many times, a lot of these toxins can be stored in fat tissue. And if we have been gaining fat over the years and storing toxins in that fat tissue, and then all of a sudden we wake up one day and go, you know what, I'm going to get in shape, and we have a very quick weight loss, or someone might undergo a lap band or a lap sleeve surgery and lose weight very, very quickly, they can actually get a very large release of those toxins into their system, simply because they're sort of melting their fat tissue away and those toxins are being released. So definitely something to think about if you're having increased weight loss and losing that fat tissue. If you start to get symptoms, please do work with somebody to see if your toxin level is actually increasing at that time. And the other issue that can cause an increased release in toxins that are already stored in our body is osteoporosis. So this can happen in both men and women. A lot of heavy metals can sometimes get stored in our bone tissue. And then as we lose estrogen through the years and we start to release some of that bone mass, some of that lead, especially lead, can leach into our systems and then cause more symptoms. So that's something also to be aware of. I think osteoporosis is problematic. Dairy intake is very problematic, and I would never recommend dairy intake as a solution to osteoporosis, because it actually makes it worse because of the balance of calcium and phosphorus in cow dairy, which is very different from human dairy, if you want to call it that. And so our system senses all that extra phosphate and says, oh, I have to release all this calcium. And it does that and then weakens our bones the more dairy we have. So that will cause not just osteoporosis, but also a release of the lead that might be stored in your body, which you might have absorbed throughout your life. Okay, so how does the body handle toxins? You know, we could have a whole week's lecture on toxins, so I'm just going to just briefly go over some highlights. I can't get into it in just 20 minutes, but I want you to get an understanding of how different things that you might hear might affect how your body handles toxins. And the first thing I want to mention is ApoE4 allele. Many of you are aware of what an ApoE4 allele is. It's basically a gene that handles a protein, and there are many different forms. There's ApoE4, ApoE3, ApoE2, and if you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you tend to handle inflammation in a more aggressive way, and you tend to have a little bit more difficulty metabolizing cholesterol and handling lipids in the body. But what your allele for ApoE is also going to determine how you handle toxins. So someone that has an ApoE4 allele or 2 alleles, so I'm a 3-4, for example, so I'm going to have a more vigorous inflammatory response to any insult in my environment that comes my way. And for toxins, this might actually be a good thing, because since my body has an increased inflammatory response, then I might not have those toxins affect me as much. However, that tends to be true for heavy metals. But when it comes to things like viruses, if you have an ApoE4 allele, you actually are more susceptible to having problems with viruses, because the ApoE4 allele makes it easier for some of those toxins, those viruses and other pathogens, to get into the brain, and then you can't get them out. So it's interesting. It could be beneficial on the one hand, it could be detrimental on the other. And again, as Nancy said, some of these things are things that are out of our control. We are born this way, as Lady Gaga says, but we do the best that we can. And when we know that this is the case, we want to pay special attention to how to protect ourselves. The other thing that I want to mention that Howard touched upon, I don't think he used this term HLA subtypes, and I don't want to get too technical, but HLA subtypes is what he was referring to on the body's ability to tag certain toxins and get them out of your system. And depending on your HLA subtypes, you might have a genetic predisposition to having difficulty recognizing a particular toxin and putting that little label on it. So your liver, when it gets to the liver, goes, I don't even know what this is, but I guess just throw it back into circulation because it doesn't have a tag on it, And so then those toxins can accumulate in your system. And different HLA subtypes have different susceptibilities to becoming toxic with certain things. For example, mycotoxins from molds or Lyme. Those are some that we know, we've seen the HLA subtypes. And when you have those, you're going to be more susceptible to having problems with Lyme disease and mold toxins. And then, as we all know, the way that we detox from these things, our body has mechanisms to detox from toxins, but usually at a slow rate. Unfortunately, the amount of toxins that we have in our society nowadays is more than we're evolved to really handle. So we want to make sure that the body's detox capacity is optimized, and you have to have good levels of nutrients. You have to be methylating properly, and the more toxins you have, the bigger the load is, the more difficult it is for your body to process those. So that's just a little bit on how the body handles toxins. Before I go on to kinds of toxins, we've all talked about inflammation, and inflammation is, I want everybody to understand that inflammation is a natural part of what happens in the body. It's part of how the body heals, and inflammation, even a healthy meal is a small inflammatory event. But it's when we have too much inflammation and we have it go on for long periods of time that we can then get those free radicals, those little electrons that shave off of molecules, and then that causes oxidative stress, which literally damages, it just oxidizes all of the other tissues, and that's how you get that damage. So I just want to mention that about inflammation. Inflammation itself is a natural process, but when it gets out of hand, then we get the collateral damage. That's what I want you to know about that. Okay, so kinds of toxins. So we know that heavy metals can be problematic for our system. We have lots of minerals in our system. We're made up of the stuff of the universe and the earth, right? All of the minerals are found in our body. However, if we have some of these heavy metals, they can be very problematic. like mercury, lead, arsenic, cadmium, et cetera, et cetera. Molds. So molds are naturally occurring organisms. There are tens of thousands of different kinds of molds, but some molds can be very problematic for our system and can affect us and be quite toxic, create lots of neurological damage, including dementia. Chemicals in our environment, you know, in the last probably since World War I, we have been creating an enormous amounts of chemicals, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and there's millions of tons produced in our country alone that we use in our environment. And the more we use, the more gets in our water supply, the more that gets in our soil. And when we have these in our environment, we can't help but be exposed to them. So we really need to understand how to limit our exposure and where to look for those things so we're not making it more difficult for ourselves. As Nancy alluded to, there's so many chemicals in our personal products. And I think this survey is from many years ago, but I think one survey said that in the morning before a woman leaves the house, she's already put on 26 different toxins in her personal products. So that could include anything from lotions to soaps to shampoos to toothpaste to perfumes to makeup, and the list just goes on and on. Pesticides. Pesticides are an increasing problem because of the way that we handle our agriculture, but also the way that we like to landscape. And for all of you who like to play golf, I just want you to be aware that golf courses are some of the most toxic places on the planet because of the amount of pesticides that are used in order to control the greens. And that can very easily soak right through your skin. Glyphosate has been getting a lot of press recently, and farmers that work with glyphosate often find that they get kidney failure pretty quickly. And that is because as it soaks into your skin, it has the ability to draw in all of these heavy metals from the environment right into your body, which then your kidneys trying to get rid of. And when it gets overloaded, it just damages the kidneys and they will shut down. So let's start off by talking about heavy metals. Mercury is often associated with silver fillings, and because there's mercury amalgam in there. And whenever you're having hot liquids or you're having friction across them, or there's two different kinds of metals in your mouth which could create an electric current, you can get release of mercury vapors, which then can go right up into your brain. So that's problematic. Fish is one of the biggest ways that people get mercury exposure. The organic mercury is the most problematic. So that's going to be the kind that is going to be ingested by fish. And the bigger the fish is, the more it has ingested. And the reason why it's getting in fish is because it's a byproduct of industrial processes. So it's released into the air as air pollution. It comes down in rain and in the air, it settles down in the water, it gets absorbed into the water and then gets into the fish. It bioaccumulates, which means it continues to build up in their system, and then the bigger fish eat the smaller fish, and then bigger fish eat the medium-sized fish, and then you get larger and larger amounts of mercury as the cycle goes on. So any large fish, tuna, swordfish, grouper, these are very large fish when they're brought to market that tend to have much higher levels of mercury. And I wouldn't recommend those fish anyway because they don't have the good fats that we want from some of those other fish like the salmon, the mackerel, the anchovies, the sardines. Mercury can also be found to some extent in vegetable and food products. It's anything that I'm going to talk about today is pretty ubiquitous in our environment. So you really need to look and see where your source is coming from if you get tested and you have high levels of mercury. So lead used to be in our gasoline, and we would breathe it in every time we would fill up the tank. I remember very fondly sitting in the back seat of the car when my dad would fill up the tank, the windows open, and breathing in the fumes. Don't ask me why. I ended up being a chemistry major. I'm into that stuff. But But, you know, we're soaking in lead, and now gasoline is unleaded, which is great, but jet fuel is not. And so we're still soaking up a bunch of lead, and the chances that it's coming in through our food, through our water, is still a possibility. And you should check and see if you have lead levels. As I said, once you get older and you start to lose bone mass, the chance that you're going to be releasing lead into your system is increased. So you should be aware of that. Cadmium. So cadmium has been shown to cause cancer and kidney damage. It's most commonly absorbed through cigarette smoke, either primary or secondary. However, cadmium can be also a byproduct of industrial processes and can get in the water supply and can get in the soil. And ironically, vegetables, those vegetables that we love so much that have lots of fiber in them, as they're growing, they suck up minerals in their fibers. Cadmium is one of them. Thallium is another one. I don't have that on my list here, but you should be aware that sometimes vegetables, even organic ones, depending on the soil that they're grown, can have heavy metals in them. So if you do get tested for metals and you find that you have a high level, you should work with your practitioner to start to figure out where is your exposure, because eliminating the exposure is going to be the #1 priority for you. And then arsenic is very common in our environment as well. It used to be, and I think it is still in some cases, added to chicken feed as a way of decreasing the growth of molds in there, ironically. And so chicken could be one source of arsenic. Arsenic can also be in the soil and therefore is absorbed in many foods. Apples can be high in arsenic. Rice can be high in arsenic. And so it's important to do a little research and see what varieties of those foods, if you eat those foods, might have less arsenic in them. Now, arsenic is not like some of the other heavy metals because it is eliminated from the body much more easily. Mercury, lead, and cadmium stay around for a long time, and your body might need help getting them out. But arsenic can be filtered right through your kidneys. It just takes, good functioning kidneys and to be well hydrated. So really the issue with arsenic is you don't want to be having a large load all the time, because that can hurt your kidneys. And then others to consider: gadolinium. If you're getting a lot of MRIs with contrast, really question getting a lot of MRIs with contrast, especially if you're getting them in very short order, like close together, because it's something that's very difficult for your body to eliminate over time. And tin and nickel are some other heavy metals that I've seen that have really affected people's neurological functioning. All right, molds. I'm going to go through this quickly. I know we don't have a whole lot of time. Molds is a very complicated topic. There are hundreds of thousands of molds in the world, and obviously when you walk outside, you're exposed to many of them. However, the ones that really cause damage for us are the ones that are found primarily in water damaged buildings or water damaged vehicles, but they also can be found in foods. So when you're outside, molds are growing in competition with other molds and with bacteria from the soil, and it really creates a balance, right? But so there's a lot of competition. There's not a whole lot of overgrowth of one type of mold or another. However, when you've got a building that's sealed off and you have some moisture in a closed, dark pocket, what happens is you get molds to start to grow unopposed from other microbes in the environment. And those molds in particular, which grow on things like drywall and products that have cellulose, wood, they can then be very toxic for our system. They can be growing inside of the walls, under the floors, in the ceilings, and we're not aware of it, but we may be breathing in those particles and the fumes that they release. I want to mention vehicles because, as Lisa mentioned, I have a practice in South Florida, and in South Florida, there's a funny pattern of weather where, a storm can just blow through in 20 minutes and then, be gone. And so sometimes people will run in and they'll leave their car windows just cracked a little bit because they're like, oh, it's going to be so hot. I'm just going to be in for a moment. And now they found that their car is just soaked on the inside. And so they never really get it dried out, and they can actually get mold growing inside the car. Molds love plastic. So they love wood and cellulose and those products, but once they get in plastic, you can never get them out of plastic. So if you have a moldy vehicle, a moldy rent-a-car, please get rid of it and get another one. I don't know how else to say it. I know people don't like to hear that, but that's what I have to say. Now, mold can wreak havoc with your system in many different ways. Howard already introduced the ideas of the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I want you to understand that with mold, a dead mold particle is just as bad as a live mold particle. So a live mold particle can be problematic because it triggers your immune system and because it's releasing compounds all the time that are toxic. But even a dead mold particle, even if it's killed with something, those pieces are something that your immune system recognizes and it's going to mount an inflammatory response against. So I don't care if it's a live mold particle or a dead mold particle, it's going to affect you adversely, and you should be aware of that. The next thing is that while molds are growing, they can be releasing these volatile organic compounds that can be carcinogenic and can be neurotoxic, like formaldehyde, like toluene. You know, these are things that we want to really avoid. Those are the things that give those people headaches and like, yeah, you know, I don't know, my apartment, it kind of smells kind of musty, or I went to this hotel room and it smelled musty, and then within an hour I had this headache, and then I had brain fog and I couldn't think clearly. That's because you were breathing in all of these volatile organic compounds that are damaging your neurological functioning instantly. And then you have mycotoxins that are released. So these are different from the volatile organic compounds. These are toxins that molds release out into the atmosphere to inhibit the growth of other molds. So all of these molds are in competition with each other, but some of these are really damaging to our system. Ochratoxins, gliotoxins, trichothecenes, you know, these are just like complicated names for all of these different mycotoxins, but those get in our system. We have trouble sometimes getting them out of our system, and they can really cause a great deal of damage to our system. So as Howard talked about, there's the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And molds are kind of like, they're like a bad joke when it comes to how they affect our immune system. Because the innate immune system, which is the part that reacts immediately to stuff without thinking about it, right? Like histamine release, so you get itchy and red and swollen and mucus and all this stuff. That's your innate immune system trying to defend against anything that it thinks is a problem. Well, mold upregulates this part of your immune system, which means that you go out for a walk and there's a little bit of pollen. Instead of getting like a 2 out of 10 response, you could get an 8 out of 10 response. And then now you've got this chronic inflammation from a response that's way higher than it should be. And chronic inflammation, we know, is a problem. Not inflammation that happens and then gets resolved, but chronic inflammation is really problematic. So the innate immune system is on hyperdrive, making you really uncomfortable, having a lot of symptoms, and causing much more collateral damage. But the joke's on us, because then our adaptive immune system actually gets down-regulated. So those immunoglobulins, that part of the immune system that's supposed to remember what to attack and then attack it, it's like half of them is out of commission. So that means if you've got a mold problem, you are going to have more difficulty getting more infections and keeping the infections that you have already in your system, which a lot of us already have viruses, keeping those at bay. Molds make that whole process much more difficult. So let's move on to chemicals, our environment. Again, there are literally textbooks with thousands of chemicals. I couldn't possibly cover them all, but I want to cover just the categories as quickly as possible so you get an idea and start to think about how these might be in your home and how you might be exposed to them. So first of all are plastics. Plastics are ubiquitous. We use plastics for everything, from drinking bottles to food containers, to liners, food storage products, shower curtains, water bottles, you name it, we've got it in plastic. And if it smells like plastic, it's a problem. It's leaching out chemicals. It's getting into our system, either breathing it in through our skin or ingesting it. Flame retardants. So right now, it's probably impossible to buy a piece of furniture or home furnishing for your home that doesn't have flame retardants on it. So it's become law now to have flame retardants in order to have things burn less quickly. However, household products are constantly like degrading and forming dust. And flame retardants have either fluorides or bromides in them to make them flame retardant. And if you know the periodic table, right, fluoride, bromide, chlorine, and iodine are all in the same place in the periodic table. And all of those will, except for iodine, obviously bromine, fluorine, and chloride will displace iodine in the system. And so then your system is not going to act as it should. It's going to be more neurotoxic, and your thyroid is probably going to be affected considerably. Bromides, by the way, are also found in all of our bakery products because they're used as dough conditioners. So something to keep in mind if you're thinking about going gluten-free, definitely do it because you also don't need the bromide. BPAs and BPSs. So this is the stuff that's classically in your water bottles. It's also in baby pacifiers, baby toys, chew toys, things like that. They are classic hormone disruptors. They have estrogenic activities. They are what are also termed as obesogens, which means that they affect our metabolism and cause us to gain weight, even though we're doing everything that we should correctly. So really think about it. And even if they say BPA free, it could have BPS, which we know can be just as bad as BPA. Okay, POFAs and PFTEs. So when Nancy spoke about nonstick pans, I love that she said, you know, if it's in your kitchen, it's not a problem until you heat it up. So if you want to have it as decoration, that's great. But as soon as you heat it up, it causes a problem. My favorite thing about nonstick pans is that the companies say, well, you know, you should always ventilate when you're using the pans in order not to breathe in the fumes. But they don't mention that those fumes just kind of stick those fluorine molecules right into your food, and then you just eat it anyway. So yeah, you definitely don't want to be breathing the fumes, but you really don't want to be eating any of the food cooked on those pans either, because they are so dangerous to our system. All right, chemicals in our personal products. Again, more than I could ever cover in this small talk, but I want to just mention phthalates and some of these other chemicals. So one of my pet peeves is direct-to-consumer marketing of drugs, but another pet peeve is this marketing of all of these fragrances that we're being brainwashed to believe is the only way that things smell fresh. So Downy Unstoppables, Glade plugins, Gain detergent, you know, you can now get your Gain scent in your fabric softener too. That's so great, except it's not, because phthalates are shown to decrease neuroplasticity in your hippocampus, which is exactly where you lay down memories. And so it is a major cause of memory issues and contributors to dementia, as well as developments, you know, not just for developing kids, but for us as we get older. Also interesting is that phthalates decrease testosterone and they interfere with masculization. So, you know, if you're concerned about your hormone levels, you do not want phthalates. They're also found in perfumes, so just be aware of that. Parabens. There's so many studies out there that say, no, but parabens really aren't that bad for you, but they are. So I'm just going to say it like it is. They're really heavily found in our cosmetics, especially. So you put them right on your skin. They're in shampoos, they're in lotions, and they mimic estrogens and are directly neurotoxic. They also decrease mitochondrial functioning. So mitochondria, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, are the energy centers of the cells. They have a multi-step process by which they create energy, and they use lots of different cofactors and vitamins, but they're very susceptible to being poisoned. Lots of these chemicals and lots of like heavy metals and things that I'm talking about, all of these toxins can decrease or poison our mitochondria. When our mitochondria get poisoned, they can't create energy, which means the entire cell suffers because all of the things that it needs to do to function properly, reproduce, duplicate its DNA, detoxify, create proteins, eliminate, you know, damaged proteins, can't happen very efficiently if they don't have the energy to do it. So parabens will directly decrease mitochondrial functioning. They cause an increase of inflammatory cytokines. Howard mentioned the cytokine storm that's happening with COVID-19. We know that people that have already higher baseline levels of inflammation, have higher levels of cytokines already floating through their systems, they are more susceptible to the cytokine storm because they're already starting off at a higher baseline. So things like tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1, interleukin 6, for those of you who are familiar with those terms, those are some very inflammatory cytokines that parabens tend to increase.
Madeleine, we have to start to wrap this
Okay.
section up.
Okay. Yeah, I think I just have one more slide. So I'll just go through this really quick. Triclosan, which Nancy mentioned, damages muscle, increases reactive oxygen species, decreases your ability to detox, and is a neurotox agent. Formaldehyde, preservative that causes cancer and damages your tissues. Heavy metals, as I already mentioned. Preservatives. So preservatives in your food and preservatives in your personal care products, anything that has benzene in it is going to be very problematic. So just read the labels very carefully, do a little research, because those can cause neurotoxicity. I'm not going to get into pesticides. I already talked about how we use them in landscaping, weed killers, and glyphosate I think I covered. And insecticides, please be aware that when you're spraying these things directly on your skin, you are absorbing them through your skin. And thank God we no longer spray DDT into the air and breathe it in, but we are literally putting it right on our skin. Solvents and cleaning products are full of toxins. I mean, solvents, disinfectants, Lysol, carcinogenic, fragrances I already mentioned, chlorinated products that help stuff get into our system and then we can't get them out. So try to use natural cleaning products, you know, going back to like vinegar, lime, OxyClean is fine, boric acid, those are really great things to use, and just soap and water without some of these very damaging chemicals. Other pathogens, which we can't get into right now, but I want you to be aware that viruses, some of the things that Howard mentioned with infections in the mouth, those can all get into your brain and cause collateral damage because of the inflammation of your body trying to handle those. So the more we can keep our infections at bay, the healthier our eating is, the better our nutrients, the better off we'll be. And then I really want to mention the toxin that no one talks about, except Nancy did mention it, my favorite, is alcohol. So alcohol, we all think it's fine, but it's a direct neurotoxin. It impairs your body's ability to detoxify. It depletes your dopamine, directly poisons your mitochondria, and so you're going to have lower cellular energy. The best way to address toxins is to avoid the exposure. If you have heavy metals or molds or chemicals, please work with a professional, because in some cases you want to remove these from your body gently. You don't want to mobilize heavy metals or molds or toxins faster than your body can eliminate them, because then you can get really acutely sick and that can precipitate symptoms for people. So I hope this has been a good introduction to toxins, and how to deal with them. And you can see how it all kinds of comes around and affects all of your metabolism in your brain. So thank you very much.